The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Does your brand have something important to say through meaningful messaging that reaches the right audience? At The Spin-off, we work closely with our partners to create bespoke campaigns that bring value to both your brand and our audience. If you're interested in learning more about partnering with us, email Beck, that's BEC, at thespinoff.co.nz.
Kia ora, this is Toby Manhire, here to urge you to tune in to Gone by Lunchtime, a podcast with me, Annabelle Lee Mather and Ben Thomas, tackling the world of New Zealand politics, from policy to polling, from scandal to psychodrama. Listen to Gone by Lunchtime, brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network, wherever good pods are sold.
Nau mai, hoki mai, ki other folds. Imihine, ko Duncan tōku ingoa. Today, it's been a run of folds which have been quite doomy, some of them in a kind of sector-wide sense, some of them very specifically about the spin-off itself. And I don't like that. That's not my general disposition, and I don't like to kind of stay in that lane. So I was trying to think about ways to talk about other aspects or alternative approaches to thinking about media that were less doomy. And what I sort of hit upon was thinking about Australia. And so this is the first of a two-part series where I'm going to speak to people in Australia about different aspects of what's going on there as a way of us thinking in New Zealand about concrete moves that could be made different kind of ways of thinking about media that might make a difference in our local context. So I'll just kind of top line what this first episode will be about. Basically, it looks at the tech regulation space in Australia, how different it is, how vibrant, how bipartisan it is in some respects, how expansive and sort of multi-agency it is at times, and just how different it is to the place here where we're sort of. I mean, we talk sometimes about being a fast follower in New Zealand, but it feels in many respects like we're going to be a really late follower or not even follow at all and just continue with like this kind of laissez-faire approach that we've done. Today's episode is about big technology and regulation and a view from Australia. So we'll go through different aspects of it. The most recent aspect is the teen social media ban, which has just passed. But there's also plans around Google Search and Commerce, about Meta's Messenger product and Apple Pay. There have been, until recently, big work streams around misinformation and local content. And obviously there's the sort of granddaddy of them all in a way, which is the Fair Digital News Bargaining Bill. But what it says collectively is they as a country have committed to thinking really hard about a really complex thing, which is legislating around large technology platforms. So joining me to have that discussion is a frequent Fold guest, perhaps our most tenured, Hal Crawford, the former head of Newshub and a good friend, coming to you live from New South Wales.
Hey, Duncan, how's it going?
Very good, man. Thanks so much for making the time. I just wondered if you could start by giving me a general sense about what the feeling is in media in Australia. And when I say media, I'm thinking about institutional media, legacy media, however you want to frame it.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to be able to provide a counterpoint to your gloom. Actually, I've been trying to do that myself. A couple of weeks back, I wrote a piece about how we could get it right in media. And for me, that was a really important exercise because our reflex has been to be so gloomy of late. Realistically, the Australian situation is similar to New Zealand. Maybe it's not quite as bleak because the market is bigger, but we're not in a bounce back here. A lot of publishers are doing it tough. There is the issue. There's lots of issues. There's systemic issues, and then there's issues that have just occurred, one-off idiosyncratic issues, but there's all sorts of terrible things happening. One of the very simple things is that Meta won't be paying $70 million into the media ecosystem in Australia, which has depressed some people. Subs are flat, I think, at most publishers' subscriptions. Ad sales are not great. And two of our biggest broadcasters have been consumed by reports of horrible cultures, corporate cultures, and that's depressing their share price along with all the systemic stuff about media. So the vibe here isn't great, but the vibe is different because of what you're talking about, which is the legislative reaction. So that's, to me, that's a good thing. And when I was writing about what we need to get right in media and how it could all come good, regulation is an important plank.
Yeah, I guess my theory of it is that it's a fundamentally kind of unjust thing and inequitable thing and actually a kind of a dangerous thing for your country to have a real-world economy and a domestically domiciled economy that is highly regulated to try and achieve good outcomes around competition and for consumers and to kind of blunt or cover the cost of negative externalities and so on, and then to have a digital economy which in many ways is replicating the physical world economy and certainly competes with it, that has no such regulation. In Australia, unlike New Zealand, it feels like that is a known problem and one that is consuming a lot of legislative and kind of political bandwidth. Is that fair to say? Like how big does this feel from an overall kind of narrative around this government perspective?
I think it's massive, and I just think it's a fundamental shift in thinking. So the elites, the governing elites, and the population in general are favourably disposed towards regulating global digital platforms. So that is a really big change. And so what's going to happen is that we're going to go through dips and peaks in this cycle of attempting to legislate global digital platforms. But it is a trend and a theme that we will see continuing for, at least a decade, probably more. This is probably a 2-decade project. So we're just at the beginning of it. New Zealand will, of course, be there as well. Like no sovereign country can afford not to be working hard on this problem. So I think it's good that Australia is starting now. Of course, it looks like a dog's breakfast when you're up close. It is, and with all the sort of horrible compromise of the political process, with all of the horrible influence of blatant self-interest that you see, all of that stuff, that might be superficially unattractive, but what is important is that this process has begun and it will continue for a long time. So people here are really into the idea of regulating global digital platforms. The question is then, okay, how do you do it technically and politically? And that's where we get into some of the troubles.
And we'll kind of get to some of the specifics shortly. I wondered if you could kind of maybe whether guess at or give me an informed sense of what is driving it into the political agenda. There was a strong feeling that with the original bargaining bill, for example, that it was essentially Murdoch kind of speaking kind of truth to power. Like he had the prompt of the ACCC report, but that he was almost negotiating with the treasurer at the time to kind of get that on the agenda. Does it remain something that it is legacy media effectively lobbying this legislation into being, or is there a broader coalition of concern than that?
I think if there was only legacy media who were interested, this would be going nowhere. So you have to have a confluence of interests, and that's what we've got. We've got, for example, the social media age ban. That's a really successful piece of legislation, even because it's passed, even though we don't actually know how it's going to be implemented. But, that appeals to the majority of voters and it appealed to the majority of political parties. And so there weren't, that sort of thing, it was really easy. It didn't have to be pushed by any particular legacy media outlets. It could just be reported on and that would sail through as it did. Of course, with the News Media Bargaining Code, which was the legislation that was used as a threat to force digital platforms to give money to news organisations, that was purely self-interest, but it coincided with this idea in society that digital platforms were not sufficiently contributing to the societies where they were deriving revenue, which is true. So, the fact that blatant self-interest, okay, give me some money or else. So that's from the point of legacy media, but it coincided with this other much deeper truth. So that's why that one got through. So in every case, when you've got a proposed piece of legislation, for example, let's fix up unfairness in app stores, or let's look at local content quotas on streaming platforms, you have to get enough incentives aligned to be able to get it across the line, because you will always face some kind of headwind from, global pushback. And we can talk about that when you want to.
The thing that's interesting to me and feels like the most striking contrast with the New Zealand political environment is that some of these bills, most notably the under 16 social media ban, have bipartisan and very popular support, even if it's not true across every single sort of front within this war. Is it broadly true that that sense of concern is not located in one or two parties, but across the spectrum? The difficulty is more about how you express that in terms of legislation.
Yeah. I mean, the number one, I don't know how you're finding it, Duncan, but the number one topic of conversation to the point of tedium at barbecues amongst parents is screen time with children. So you can't be a politician and be unaware of that. Otherwise, you're just not doing your job. So given that parents constitute a fair whack of the electorate and then their concerns extend to grandparents and all of that, and people hear what they're saying. This is why we have a political system. It's so that the concerns of the many can be heard. How do you turn a very sort of general and generalized concern and anxiety around my kids spending too much time with these devices? How do you turn that into legislation? Well, you have to probably be a little bit populist about it. You have to focus on something that can actually be done. Banning children under 16 from using social networks can be done. Certainly can be legislated. We've proved that. We'll see how it actually comes into being. But that's absolutely a political win, because it's passed both houses of parliament and it passed with bipartisan support. Most people in the electorate support it, and there's an election coming up. So, you're the government, you've done something, and people support it. That is, you're ticking all the boxes there.
So I want to talk about that in detail, but there's one more sort of actor in this who seems it's important to address at the top level before we go down into specifics, and that's the ACCC, which is, in New Zealand, the equivalent is the Commerce Commission, which for quite some time seems to have taken quite an activist posture towards big technology, both in terms of, it's doled out fines and taken cases around some, whether it's competition elements, but it also, it seems to have a kind of persistent scrutinizing focus on big technology platforms as they relate to the different facets of the Australian market. That's a huge contrast with here, where we, it almost feels like our Comcom has been explicitly told, don't even touch it. Why? What's driving that? Do you think, and how big of a role does the ACCC play in keeping that front of mind for Australians?
Honestly, I don't know what I can't answer. I can't speak to the difference. What I can say is that during the news media bargaining development process, that was totally driven by the ACCC here in Australia. So Rod Sims at the time was the director, and he personally believed that there was a burning need for some kind of mechanism to bring the digital platforms to the table. So I didn't agree with the news media bargaining code. I still think that it's absurd. It's a terrible piece of legislation in my view. I've actually had conversations with Rod Sims, and it's very difficult for me because I'm quite a polite person. So I'm like, well, just explain to me how this crazy piece of legislation actually makes sense.
How did he go on explaining it, do you think?
Oh,
in your conversations?
He just didn't answer my questions. It's like
good approach.
Yeah, it's a classic block and score. It's like, no, you're wrong, and I'll tell you why I'm right. So the good thing about the News Media Bargaining Code is that it proved that something could be done. It showed that national assemblies and national regulatory bodies could actually act in a way that impacted global digital platforms. Because before that, everyone sort of thought it was kind of too hard, impossible. Like, what do we do? I mean, you can take I quite like the Australian approach because if you look at the EU, they have also taken a fierce regulatory stand. But what they've come up with is terrible. It's seemingly, for the most part, it's having really big impacts on European consumers. It's an attempt to meddle in a deep way that impacts the future of technological products. And I'm speaking very broad brush here, and I'm sure that there are great elements of EU legislation, but in general, I don't like it. For example, I've closely worked in mis and disinformation law, and their mis and disinformation reporting law requires all of these figures to be reported. And what's happened is that they're being reported in massive spreadsheets that are mostly blank but filled out where they need to be filled out by the digital platforms, and they're useless to everyone. So, the idea was good, but the execution was poor. And hopefully that's what we can avoid in Australia and New Zealand.
Shop Blinds.com's Cyber Monday sales event now for some of the best deals of the season. A Blinds.com design expert can help you make the perfect selection on your schedule. We can handle everything from measure to your whole home installed for one low cost. With over 25 million windows covered, Blinds.com is the #1 online retailer of custom window coverings. Save up to 50% site-wide, plus doorbusters and a free professional measure right now at Blinds.com. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
So let's talk about the most recent change, which is, in some ways it's similar to the bargaining bill because there is a lot of people who've thought very hard about this, think that banning social media for under 16s is, the necessity for it is unclear, and how you define what social media is and therefore how you implement it is much trickier than they've made out. And yet it's very popular and it's passed. Can you just sort of top line what the legislation is and how they have attempted to kind of define it? Yeah.
Look, I'm not an expert on this. I have, before this conversation, I actually reviewed the legislation. It's very short. It's an amendment to the Online Safety Act, which was passed a few years ago. It just whacks into that legislation this requirement that digital platforms that are designated, that are the ones that are said to be the relevant ones in this case, they have to block anyone who's under 16 from accessing those. interestingly and weirdly, and kind of it's not weird. There's a reason for it, but they talk about how you prove that you're the right age, and you're not allowed to. If you're a digital platform, you're not allowed to solely rely on government issued ID to verify that. So presumably the reason, there's some kind of civil liberty reason for that, and to avoid the accumulation of massive amounts of dodgy, very important data, personal data with social media platforms. But that leaves, when you look at the legislation, it's like, okay, well, how are these digital platforms that aren't supposed to solely rely on digital government issued ID, how are they going to actually make sure that people are older than 15? And they talk about, there's a vague phrase where they talk about biometrics, looking at someone's face. So it could be that this is just a bit of a joke, and that every 15-year-old and 14-year-old can easily get around it. That would be bad, because it would be a betrayal of the intention of the legislation. It could be that it just makes it very much more difficult for everyone to sign up to a social media account. All of those things are quite possible or even probable, I would say.
The way they've defined social media, as I understand it, is it's about situations where sort of messaging and interaction are at the core of the product. So like YouTube is specifically excluded, but Snapchat, TikTok, Instagram are all ruled in. How have they sort of gone about defining that? And is there I've heard that there might be a way for teens to use it if they're logged out, i.e., which is where a lot of the
I think it is one of the requirements that login an account is required. It's not the legislation isn't applicable to services that don't require login.
TikTok, for example, doesn't require a login, and that could be a way for it to keep
that
some
could be
of
a way out. Yeah, that could be a way out.
Then it's kind of inferring things about the audience without knowing them to the same extent as a logged-in user.
Yeah, I mean, all of these things, right? What do you think, Duncan? I mean, all of these things sort of like TikTok sounds like an edge case because it's mostly a consumption medium. Of course, there are lots of people making things. It's YouTube-like in that respect. It doesn't seem to me like a classic social media platform. It's more like a video consumption and content creator gig. So should TikTok be in scope? Well, it intends. What are you trying to do with the legislation? And do you want it to be in scope? So look, I think it speaks. Of course, when you look into the specifics, it looks pretty ugly. It's when you talk to kids, a lot of them say, "Well, this doesn't feel great for me." I've spoken to my kids about it, and they actually don't sort of care about this legislation. And the reason they don't care is that I don't let them use social media anyway. So it's kind of like, okay, well, maybe I'm just a real authoritarian, but I'm like, TikTok is absolute terror. I just think short form video in general is terrible for your attention span, and I know that for myself. I don't want to sit on even YouTube Shorts and just open mouthed consume video after video. I notice what it does to my kids' sort of emotional state after an hour of doing that, and I'm like, okay, I don't want it. We're not having that app on your phones. That's going. So my kids personally don't care. I think some parents are just not in that position, and giving them some assistance, regulatory assistance, is a really good idea. I think it's the right instinct from the government. So I'm supportive.
It's interesting, right? Because Jesse Mulligan wrote an interesting piece about this over the weekend, where in New Zealand it feels like where something is complex or where there are trade-offs, the fact of there being trade-offs is enough to scupper the legislation, and which he sort of suggested was the wrong approach, and I agree, in that all of these things are complex, and we should look at them on a net basis. Is society on a net basis better off for having got through, having passed this, even if there are some downsides to it? And I think
this is classic philosophy, Duncan. This is classic philosophy. It's like, are we Platonists, and do we have to make a law that is logically pure without any edge cases that speaks to the essence of what we want to achieve? Or actually, are we just creating something that by and large has a positive effect? And I think we want to do the latter. I think we want to say Plato was a real problem and we don't want to go there.
Yeah, and I think that this is a classic example of that. Like, there are good things that happen on social media. There are kids for whom it's their main, connection point to their friends. But I think by and large, as you suggest, and you can see that in I think it was 77% public support for it, is that most parents, if it were up to them, wouldn't have it and would prefer it to be at a kind of system-wide level rather than them feeling like they're the decider. And we saw a similar thing here with our cell phone ban as well. I just wanted to kind of move on to a sort of a few other pieces of legislation. There's a couple of which have fallen over, and the first is the misinformation law, which another thing that's really, really, you sort of know it when you see it, but it's actually quite hard to define and really hard to know what to do with it. Where does it collide with sort of freedom of speech and so on? And I know that with your background, you've thought a lot about this. Tell me about what they were trying to do and why it fell apart. Yeah,
well, this was a really interesting one because misinformation, compared to an underage social media ban, misinformation is about 10 times as hard. And it hinges on, there's so many traps here. One is, what is misinformation? That's the big one. It's like, well, our whole society moves on people repudiating other positions, and the fact that those positions, so even scientific positions, eventually end up being outmoded, but you have to go through the process of disproving them. So that's one very difficult issue. Another issue is the question of political influence and influence over the fourth estate. That's a tough one, and certainly one that's been turned into a political football in New Zealand before. So you've got to, legislation has to be politically realistic as well as having a beneficial effect. And if your opposition is just going to use your own legislation to whack you over the head, then that's not smart.
What's an example of the way it might have been used that's sort of specific and kind of helped dismantle the case for it?
I think the problem with the misinformation bill was that only the government supported it and everyone else sort of just wanted nothing to do with it. And in Australia, where the government doesn't have control of the Senate, you need to get wide buy-in from other parties to actually pass anything. So that's the reason they just gave up on it. So that's the short answer. The big answer is that it's very easy to weaponise the idea that the government is going to tell you what is true and what isn't true. And that in our society, as in New Zealand society, is completely unacceptable. Now, that wasn't what the misinformation bill was about. So perhaps it was clumsy, perhaps it wasn't done well. Could have probably just focused on disinformation. That's by definition, incorrect information on purpose, like it's lies. And so disinformation, lying on purpose, is much easier to make legislation about, because you're not just saying, you're not allowed to forward anything about, the bad effects of vaccines, say, because, if you're forwarding information for some sort of malicious reasons, then you fall within the scope of disinformation. So the main reason that bill didn't get up in Australia was that it was too easy to weaponise in opposition. It was like, the government is going to tell you what to believe. That wasn't going to happen. It was actually, we have an independent body called the ACMA, the broadcasting regulator, and that was going to be responsible for it. That is an independent body like New Zealand On Air or, VSA or anything like that. It's not the government. It quite expressly isn't the government. And furthermore, they weren't going to rule on specific pieces of content. They were just going to make sure that digital platforms had in place systems to get rid of misinformation or to downplay it, but most importantly, just to report on it. Because I'm involved in actually this voluntary code at the moment in Australia that operates and reports on disinformation and misinformation. I'm an independent auditor of those reports, and I frequently get frustrated because I don't have enough power to tell them what to do. So, that's my particular position. I was probably, the only supporter of the misinformation and disinformation bill that I know of. So clearly it didn't have broad enough support.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Because some of what we're talking about is invariably about the extent to which a platform makes a good faith and kind of earnest attempt to deal with content which it should know, largely through user reporting, is some kind of problem on the platform, on its platform. The example that I cite is Dylan Reeve, who did a fantastic and kind of infuriating piece for the Spin-Off a few months ago about which basically consisted of dozens of examples of, it was almost like a taxonomy of the then current state of Facebook scam advertising, which he was diligently reporting to the platform, and the response he got. And these were just anyone, like you'd have had 100% belief that these things were scams to any kind of trained eye. They had made up and defamatory headlines involving celebrities and a sort of facsimile of an RNZ or a Herald type website to give them an imprimatur of authority. And every time they were rejected after a week, and it wasn't a week, it was 6 days and 12 hours every single time. And these were paid advertisements saying that they didn't violate their community guidelines. And I think that's the thing that's frustrating, is that this is Facebook, particularly as a platform, does not, given the sophistication of its systems, it could clearly kind of find a way to automate a process that would flag and remove these ads prior to even being launched. However, it not only doesn't, but it rejects that, and it continues to take them as a revenue stream. How much of it, in your experience, do you think it is about a platform that is just purely financially motivated, that doesn't have any kind of impulse within it to, or kind of fiscal reason to stop a particular behaviour? It's particularly infuriating, isn't it? Because
you've got lots of examples in NZ of these egregious scams, and we've got even more in Australia, and some pretty high-profile ones as well. For Andrew Forrest, for example, famously a billionaire, is suing Meta in the US as well as Australia. I mean, it's completely intolerable, right? However, that represents a failure of their own system, right? Clearly, those ads are not allowed under their own terms of service. It's a failure within Meta. So the question is, what is the feedback to Meta? What is the feedback mechanism for a failure of its own system? And clearly, it's insufficient at the moment for us in both Australia and New Zealand, because they are benefiting from that failure, and that they shouldn't be allowed. There should be much more steep and strenuous repercussions if they do that. So, in Australia, Facebook has partnered with banks to share scam information so that they say that they've cracked down on these considerably, famously, even more famously than Andrew Twiggy Forrest. There was David Koch, who was a morning TV personality. He was used to defraud any very reliable, sort of bald glasses, financial guy, used to defraud pensioners of their life savings, and not just one, but several. And, that's really intolerable, and there should be, dire consequences for an advertising platform that facilitates that, which is what has happened in this case. So I think that Meta's move on that is purely to, try to fix its internal systems, but also avoid, external regulation. That sort of thing has to be fixed up. That has to be improved. It seems to me at the moment that the consequences just aren't severe enough for allowing that kind of scam to go on your platform. I mean, this is a specific case of a general problem we have, which we should talk about, Duncan, which is the lack of responsibility that digital platforms take for any kind of content on their platforms. And, we've gone through this whole environment where they've always been compared to telecommunications carriers. Now, it's clear that they are not, that they are something more than that. They're not quite publishers. They're not commissioning the work and, benefiting from it in that respect. But they are benefiting from it. Just that there's somewhere in between. There's somewhere in between a telecommunications company and a publishing platform. That's where they lie. And there has to be an enhanced sense of responsibility for the content.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that sort of irks me about it ultimately is that, Section 230, the sort of, which kind of, this US legislation that birthed the idea that the carrier of user-generated content effectively did not bear responsibility for it in the same way that, a newspaper or a TV channel would. And I think that on some level that was defensible when it, but for a period of time.
Can I take you back? Because I was a massive freedom of information person in the past. And when that passed, because I'm that old, I was like, yeah, that's so cool. That's exactly what we need.
Well, there was this kind of idea that the internet could wash away a lot of the sins of the offline world, the gatekeepers. There was this kind of, information wants to be free, this kind of anarchist, Lawrence Lessig kind of was a big proponent of it, spirit that drove the internet. And I just think that the new boss was a lot worse than the old boss because it had so much more ability to profit from this, but took far less responsibility than the original one. And I guess I think about the algorithm that drives feeds and that surfaces information. That's where they cross the line from being more like a telco to being more like a publisher, because they're doing that on the basis that they can get more attention and therefore more ad revenue. But at that point, even though it's lines of code that are making that decision, it's still fundamentally a company's interest-driven decision to prioritize some content over others, and therefore you should be,
100%.
Selling advertising against it.
Yeah.
You have to be responsible for it.
It has to be, because you benefit from the actions of the algorithm. And if you benefit from the actions of the algorithm, you bear some responsibility for the consequences. And this is a standard sort of philosophical principle that we need to have here that is not implemented in regulation as yet.
So obviously the misinformation bill fell over, but there must be some level of heat that exists. I know that the ACCC has levied like 8-figure fines against Facebook, but it is also, Meta just recently announced that within the financial services category, and now I would argue that it should be much broader than that, it will at least verify the identity and make sure that they have an Australian business number and so on of advertisers in that space. Do you know what drove it to make that decision? Because interestingly, I spoke to Meta earlier this week and they confirmed that they have no plans to do that in New Zealand. Again, this feels like a result of there's pressure in one environment and none in another. Therefore, they're becoming a marginally more responsible actor in one sector and have no intention of doing so in its neighbour.
Yeah, it's interesting. Look, I can't comment on the internal reasonings at Meta, and it is a massive corporation. I've been really interested in thinking financially recently. And as soon as you start thinking financially, you think value for shareholders, the shareholders are the owners, and I've got to maximize value, then all of this stuff starts to make sense, right? And it's not, they will operate, I don't think digital platforms have been particularly evil or evil at all, in fact. I think that the systems that they preside over and have developed are totally logical. And they will be totally logical when we put in regulation which protects the interests of society. And so there'll be a lot of noise and hoo-ha as we do it. After we've done it, if it is legislation and regulation that makes sense, then they'll get on with it. They will operate within those frameworks because they have to. That's what that's how our entire society works. And everyone knows that the commercial system, the ability to make money, which is what they want to do, relies on those regulations. So it really is, what is happening in New Zealand isn't right. It's the legislators who have to get off their ass and do the difficult work. And within that, they have to feel what the needs of the society are, and they have to legislate sensibly. We're trying to do that in Australia. I don't think it's such an ugly process. It is actually happening. It's gonna keep coming around. I think what's going to happen in the immediate future, Duncan, is that it's going to die away for a little bit because of Trump. So no one wants to pick a fight with a tariff-mad Trump, and that's what's going to happen if you try to implement a levy, or if you, if you institute a misinformation law that is bad for X or whatever. It's all going to be, game on, and you're going to suffer. But I think this broader trend is going to continue well past the 4-year term of Trump, and we've got to build, and people have got to start talking about it, and legislators have got to start thinking about it, because it's not easy.
Talofa lava. I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spin-Off. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spin-Off member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spin-Off. You can help us keep all of The Spin-Off's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. So just before I let you go, I just want to hit on another couple of pieces of work that, certainly there is conversation about here, but there definitely doesn't appear to be any legislative groundswell. The local content quotas on Netflix. Now, I recognize that this is really different. This is the idea that a certain percentage of local content must be from Australia for a streamer to operate there. That replicates the fact that I think it's around 20% of content between particular hours has to be made in Australia for the broadcast networks. The hard thing to do is just the absolute scale and depth of the libraries there, and just how you'd make the maths work. Yeah, just tell me about how that fell away, and but still, you can still feel even the fact of the discussion seemed to prompt Netflix to do a lot more commissioning locally than it would otherwise. And in New Zealand, for example, there's been none. So it's just the fact of having a discussion, acknowledging it as a problem. Even if you don't arrive at legislation, you still get some motion.
Yeah. I mean, it was helped here by the fact that Stan, owned by Nine, was already commissioning local content, and it was using that as a point of differentiation, and it was working. So that helps commercial businesses see the light. In Australia, we have a really clear precedent of 55% of content on broadcast TV between 6 a.m. and midnight has to be Australian. So that helps news a huge amount, because news is the most cost-effective bulk content that you can get in that slot. But
sports too, right?
Sports, news, and then, the old production. So that helps. And then they've shaped that differently for cable, where there's a commitment for a certain amount of money that you have to put into local productions. Now, the best form of that for a local streaming company would be presumably spend on local productions, because it's just so hard to quantify that.
Maybe as a percentage of revenues, for example.
Percentage of local revenue. So let's not get into solution mode, but that's kind of like, okay, spend X chunk of local revenues on local production. And, New Zealand On Air, for example, very good at defining what that would actually look like. So that's all totally doable. Now, the reason that it didn't get up in Australia, because it was being seriously contemplated and has been for a long time, was a free trade argument. So apparently it was going to breach of international free trade obligations. So sheer stupidity, right? Because everyone knows about this. This is not, this is a terrible loophole that someone found at the last minute. Everyone knows about free trade. The Canadians have, in their free trade agreements, they have cultural carve-outs. And that means, like, if you, for a cultural reason, have to support a local industry like the ballet or whatever it is, then you're allowed to do that. So under that, you'd have to make sure you have a carve-out for local entertainment production. But we don't.
And lastly, that there's the kind of looming AI piece behind all this. And generative AI is this very challenging technology because, it is using a sort of a feedstock, which is not, there's a lot of, but not entirely journalistic in nature. And it made use of that in ways that were completely unimagined by, journalism or content companies when they put that information online. There's also the example of, YouTube, which apparently had all of its content ingested. So there's this whole kind of legally ill-defined grey area that has resulted in the creation of these kind of vast, very highly valued and very impactful companies that, again, there will be a kind of both a legal and a regulatory kind of processing of what that means and a value assigned to having real-time information put into that system. What's going on in that space over there? I saw that there is an attempt to kind of collectively bargain by some facets of the Australian news media with the AI companies. Can you give me a sense of what's going on?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what's happening with that collective attempt. I suppose I could talk just generally about how this should go. There's a bunch of media companies that have made one-off arrangements with OpenAI and other prominent AI companies, and that's probably just getting in while they can and getting whatever money they can because the horse is effectively bolted. Also, we're on very uncharted waters. It's unprecedented. So who owns the collective intellectual property of the English language? Well, we've never had to think about that before. This is a sort of a legacy and it is a commons. It always has been a commons, and we've never even thought about it. Like that entity, English, and all of the history and knowledge that goes into that corpus of billions of words, is that owned by anyone? Not really, but surely there is some sort of collective sense of ownership. Surely you can't just use that for your own advantage and enrichment at the expense of others. The problem, again, and this is where we get to foundational bedrock principles that we need to get to actually solve the problem. This is much worse than Google's dominance of search or Meta's dominance of social media. This is absolutely basic. And if you use ChatGPT now, you know exactly what I'm talking about, which is you basically don't need to use a search engine anymore. If your AI agent has access to news, you basically don't need news providers anymore. You just ask, okay, so what's happening? I passed a car crash the other day. What's happening on the Bulli Pass, for example? If my AI had full and unfettered access to all news feeds, I wouldn't bother going anywhere else. I would just talk to it about the news. I would get it to summarize. It knows me. It's going to be better than a TV station as soon as it has that information, which means, all of that means that news companies have to jealously protect the information that they surface. This is not the web. There is no reciprocation here, zero. You are not getting any links back. You're getting no traffic. In effect, you have a parasitic entity feeding off your information and profiting from it. That I know that I sound like someone from News Corporation now. That wasn't true in the past and isn't true of certain other situations. It is true about this situation. So that we have to find a solution to that. I don't think one-off payments from AI companies is the answer.
That's quite sobering. Lastly, you're describing multiple strands, some of which are active, some of which are past, some of which, have kind of faltered for one reason or another. But it paints a collective portrait of, a sense of motion and a sense of that this must be a kind of alive and constant beat of your politics. We also have an election coming up in Australia. How much confidence do you have that not just individual strands, which may come and go or be changed, but that the overall kind of sense of it is an Australian thing and it is in Australia's interests to continue to view big technology platforms through a particular lens and legislate to defend the national interest against them?
Yeah, I think that's going to continue. So there's the precedent, there's the way that people are thinking. It's just this conversation. So the fact that people are having a conversation about, how do we raise a levy on digital platforms, that indicates that it will continue and that we will find a way. It's more the key is to begin the process by understanding that you can influence your own destiny. That is just so incredibly fundamental to what it is to be a nation, right? That approach has got broad support in Australia, which means that it will continue. It doesn't matter who wins the election early next year. The process is going to continue. Of course, if Labor wins here, then it might happen sooner. But the Liberals, the coalition government here, the more conservative side of politics, can also see that there is a lot of political mileage in supporting regulating digital platforms. They can see that now.
All right, Hal, thank you. That's such a good window into what's happening in Australia and really isn't happening here. We didn't even get to the digital bargaining bill, which maybe we should let's just do 30 seconds on that, because obviously it's something I've discussed endlessly on this podcast. But can you give me a sense of how that's tracking and what might replace it were it to kind of fall over there?
Yeah, so the digital bargaining bill here, it's called the News Media Bargaining Code. It is not tracking well. So it has been used as threat. It's been sitting on the shelf here. The question is, will the Treasurer, the Finance Minister, will he designate Meta? Basically designation means you will be subject to the code. And the reason why that comes up is because Meta has stopped paying news companies here. In other words, they're completely flouting the intention of the law. They've announced that in March, so it's a long time ago, and basically nothing has happened. The reason that nothing has happened is that this is crap legislation that isn't written in the right way. It's not doing what it says it does. So I think it's not working for structural reasons. What could happen is that Meta could be designated. Before that or after that happens, Meta will pull all of their news from Facebook in Australia, Facebook and Instagram, and that will be bad for the government. So don't think that's going to happen before the election.
And is there a sense of, given that it's crap legislation, it's no longer working, and of what might replace it?
Well, this is something that I've worked on quite a bit and talked about, particularly with some colleagues at the University of Technology Sydney, UTS, the way to raise a digital levy. So what would replace it is a digital platform levy, and then a distribution of that funds according to transparent principles to news media. That's a complicated one, but just to put in one thing that I think is important is that I think this starts with a requirement for certain digital platforms to carry news. I think that's the foundational principle, and you have to start there. So who has to carry news, and why do they have to carry news, and how do they carry news? Then you can start on levy raising and levy distribution.
All right, that's such a great primer on the situation in Australia. Thank you so much for making the time, Hal. Really appreciate it as always. And hopefully we can get a similar level of energy and attention into our political environment at some point in the future.
Pleasure, Duncan. So great to talk to you as always.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at The Spinoff. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spinoff member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, senior writer at The Spinoff. We wouldn't exist without the ongoing support of our generous members. If you're able to, you can make a donation at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spinoff Podcast Network.